Okay, so good day. For today, we're going to discuss about control structure. No? So after this module, the student should have learned and able to discover conditional statement of PHP and to be able to utilize the use of conditional statement of PHP. Conditional structure or control structure. Okay, number one is the if statement. If statement are used to compare two values and carry out diverse events based on the results of the test. If statement take the form if then else, basically the if part checks for a condition. If it is true, then statement is executed. If not, the else statement is executed. So we have also if else if statement, no? And switch statement. There are times when an if statement is not the most efficient way to check for certain condition. Let's say, for example, we might have a variable that stores travel destinations and you want to pack according to this destination variable. So in this example, you might have 20 different locations and that you would have to check with a nasty long block of if, else, if, or else if statement. So this doesn't sound like much fun to code. Let's see if we can do something different. So with the use of the switch statement, you can check for all these conditions at once. Then and the great thing is that it is actually more efficiently programming to do this. A true win-win solutions. The way the switch statement works is it takes a single variable as input and then check it against all the different cases you set up for uh, that switch statement. Instead of having to check that variable one at a time, as it goes through a bunch of if statement, the switch statement only has to check one time. Okay? So this will be an example of a demonstration of PHP conditional statement.
In this episode, we're going to talk about something called if, else, and else if statements inside PHP. And these are actually something you're going to use quite often when you do actually write PHP code inside a website. So let's actually go ahead and talk about a coding example where we do actually write out the code. And then afterwards, I'll explain to you guys how we can use this inside a website. So as you guys can see right now, we do actually have a variable called x, which is equal to 1. Now underneath here, we're actually going to go ahead and write our if-else statements. So basically the idea behind if-else statements is that we can say if something specific is true, then do this. If something else is true, then do this instead. So we can actually go ahead and write an if statement by saying if, parentheses, curly brackets. So basically inside the parentheses, we're going to put the condition which needs to be true in order to do whatever's inside the curly brackets. So inside the parentheses, we can actually say if variable x is the same as 1, is equal to 1, then write echo string, and then we can say Daniel is very handsome. Now, if this is true, which it actually is right now, I can actually go inside my browser, refresh, and you guys can see it does actually say Daniel is very handsome. Now, let's say that x is 2 or something else. It doesn't have to be 2. It can be anything other than 1. Right now, it's not going to do anything inside the browser because we're only checking if this is true, then do this. Now, in order to do something if something else is true other than what we wrote in here, we can write what is called an else statement, where we say if anything else is true, do this. And we can actually go ahead and take the echo, just kind of copy it, put it down here, And we can actually say Daniel is very ugly, which of course wouldn't actually be true, but let's actually say we have Daniel is very ugly down here. So in this case, we would actually go inside the browser, and you guys will see it does actually say Daniel is very ugly. Now, this is all good and fun, but let's actually say we want to check if there's more conditions other than the if statement that needs to be true in order to do something else. We can actually write something called an else if statement. So if we actually go in between the if and else statement, we can actually move the else statement down a little bit. We can write something called an else if, parentheses, curly brackets, and then this works essentially the same way as our if statement. So if I do actually copy my x variable up here inside the if statement, put it inside my else if statement, and change this one to 2, we can actually write something, we can echo out something else instead of Daniel is very handsome. You can say Daniel is kinda handsome. So in this case, since it's actually equal to 2 up here in the x variable, it will in fact say Daniel is kinda handsome. So we can actually change this variable up here back and forward in order to actually change the text. Now, you might be asking, well, what can we actually use this for inside a real website? Well, let's actually say you have a login system inside your website and you're logged in. Now, based on if you're logged in or not, we can actually go in and check, is Daniel in fact logged in? Okay, he is. So if he is logged in, we can actually go ahead and echo out maybe an image, a profile image up in the corner of the website, because he is in fact logged in. Kind of like when you're on Facebook. If you're actually logged in, you can actually go to a user page, that's your user page. So these are certain ways we can actually check this sort of thing. Now, we can also, if you want to add more statements, you can actually go ahead and just copy your else if statement and paste it below here many times and change these from 3, 4, blah blah blah. And then we also have the default one saying else, if anything else other than all these statements, then do this down here. So these are the basic ways you can do basic checks with if, else if, and else statements. Now, if you actually have a lot of statements, we can also write something called a switch. And we'll actually talk about that in the next episode. So for now, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you guys next time. In this episode, we're going to talk about something called a switch inside PHP. And the basic idea behind a switch is that we can do something different inside the browser depending on some kind of answer we might have. So in our example, our answer is going to be x, which is equal to 1. So the way we write out a switch is by writing switch, parentheses, curly brackets, and you guys might recognize it looks very similar to an if statement. It's not exactly the same though, because in an if statement, you do actually have different conditions underneath each other like this, where in a switch, you write all the different possible answers inside the curly brackets itself. So let's actually go ahead and write out one different case that actually says if x, for example, is equal to 1, then do this. So the way we do that is by writing out case, space, and then we need to write what answer it should be. And in this case, it's going to be 1. Then we're going to go ahead and say colon. Let's actually go ahead and move down to the next line. And then we're going to go ahead and put in the code that needs to go inside the browser if x in fact is equal to 1. So let's actually go ahead and say we're going to echo. And then we're going to put in a string that says the answer is 1. Now after we're done giving out the answer, we need to put in something called a break. And the break essentially says that now we're ending case number 1. So we also need to add one more thing, because right now we didn't actually tell the switch what we're actually checking for. And in our case, we're actually checking variable x. So we need to put variable x inside the parentheses. So now if we go into the browser and refresh, you guys can see it says the answer is 1. Because in this case, x is actually equal to 1, and we did actually check if it was equal to 1 down here. Now, if I go ahead and copy this case, move it down to the next line here, we can actually change case 1 into, for example, a string called number, as an example. And then we can actually go ahead and say the answer is number. Now the thing we can change here to change the answer is by going up into variable x, changing equal to 1 into a string called number. So now if x is equal to number, then it's actually going to go ahead and say the answer is number. So if I refresh the browser, you guys will notice that it changes to the answer is number. So we can add a lot of different cases here. We can actually copy these and just kind of paste them underneath each other. We can change number to 2, an actual integer, 3, and 4. So now we have 4 different cases where we count depending on if it's 1, 2, 3, or 4. It's going to do something specific. So we can actually change this to 2, 3, and 4. So as you guys can see, we can actually change our variable up here and say if it's 4, then it's going to say the answer is 4, of course. Now, this is all good, but let's actually say we have some kind of answer that we don't actually have listed inside our cases. We're going to go down to the next line, and then we're going to write something called default. Now the default is going to say, okay, if the answer is something else that we did not state in here, then it's going to do this down here. So we're going to go ahead and say echo. I'm just going to copy the top line here. Echo, and then we're going to say there is no answer. And we don't actually need to put a break underneath the default, because the break is just whenever we have a new case after the next one, we need to add a break before the new case. And because we don't have any new cases after the default, we're not going to put a break. So if I do actually go up and say that x is equal to, let's say 8, which I don't actually have listed down in my break, it's going to say there is no answer. So that's the basic idea behind a switch. And this is actually a really nice thing to have if you just need to check for answers and not conditions like we do in if-else statements and that sort of thing. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. In the next episode, we're actually going to start talking about doing something specific inside the browser with all the different code we've done so far. So we'll actually learn how to actually do something with our PHP code. Because up until now, all the lessons we've done so far has all been focused on teaching you guys the fundamentals of PHP that you actually need to know before you can start using it. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.
Okay, so this time I'll just want to show you an activity which you could able to create a PHP calculator.
In this episode, we're going to talk about how to actually make something inside the browser using PHP code. Because in all the past episodes, all we've talked about is all the fundamentals in PHP, but we haven't actually done anything yet we can actually use inside a website. So my thought was, for this episode, we're going to try to build a calculator inside the browser. And yes, I know a calculator is not the most interesting thing to build, but it's a really good exercise for you guys to get into the mindset when you code PHP code. Because PHP is very different from HTML and CSS. So if you guys follow along this episode and just kind of write code with me, you guys should get the hang of PHP pretty quickly. So as you guys can see, right now I do actually have a regular HTML5 setup inside a front page called index.php. And this is the document we're going to start working from. Now, you guys should already know how to set up a document like this, because you should know HTML and CSS before you go into PHP. So we're just going to go ahead and get started now. Inside our body tag, we're going to start setting up our calculator. And my thought for the calculator was that we're going to have 2 inputs where we can actually write numbers in. And then after the inputs, we can decide with the drop down what kind of, calculation we want to do, if we want to add or subtract, multiply or divide. And then we're going to have a button where we calculate. So we hit the button and then it actually calculates it for us. So the first thing we need to create in order to actually have a PHP calculator is a form. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a form inside my HTML code, like so. And the first thing we're going to create is an input. Now the first input is just going to be a regular text type input. So we're going to set the type as text. And then afterwards, we're going to go ahead and give it a name. Because when we use PHP code and we need to use it together with forms, we need to use names inside the inputs to actually refer to those inputs when we code PHP code. So in this case, we're going to call the first one num1. Now, we're also going to include a placeholder, just so we have something we can actually see inside our browser. So I'm going to set the placeholder as number 1. So after we save this, or at least after we create this, we're going to go ahead and copy it, paste it below. And then I'm just going to go ahead and change the name to num2. And then I'm going to change the placeholder to number 2. So after we have this, we can actually go ahead and refresh our browser just to see what we have so far. And as you guys can see, now we have 2 input fields where we can write something. And this is good for now, but we actually need some more stuff in here. Now the next thing we're going to include is like a drop down where we can actually select if we want to add, subtract, multiply, or divide. So the way we're going to do that is by creating something called a select. Now a select is essentially just where we go in and give it a couple of options for the drop down. So inside the select tags, we're going to go ahead and say option, like so. And then we're going to go ahead and give the first one the name add, or at least we're going to write add in between the option tags. Then we're going to copy the option tags just about maybe 5 more times, I think. And then we're going to change the first option to none. Then we're going to change the third one to subtract. The fourth one, we're going to say multiply. And the last one, we're going to say divide. So now that we have these, we can actually go ahead and give the select one a name, because like I said, we do need to give it a name to refer to it when we use PHP code. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a name inside the select tag. The name, in this case, we're just going to go ahead and set as operator. Like so. Now that we have this, we can actually go ahead and refresh the browser so you guys can see. Now we have a drop down where we can actually, select one of these options here. So the next thing we need to do is include a button, because we do actually need to be able to actually hit something and calculate. So underneath the select button, we're going to give it a break, because we need to go down to the next line and add a button. And down here, we're just going to go ahead and add a regular button. Now inside the button tags, we're going to go ahead and say calculate, so we know what this button does. And inside the button tag, the tag itself, we're going to go ahead and give it a name as well. So we're going to set the name as submit. Afterwards, we're going to give it a value as submit as well. And then we're going to go ahead and set a type as well, which is going to be equal to submit as well. I'm saying as well a lot of times here, but it really is a lot of repeating in this one. So after we have this, you guys will notice that we can now write something in here. Let's actually go ahead and write 5 in the first one, 10 in the second one. We can say add and calculate. Now what you guys will notice is that as soon as we hit calculate up in the URL, after our actual URL, we're going to get a question mark. And after the question mark, we have num1 equal to 5 and num2 equal to 10 and operator equal to add and submit equal to submit. So this is all the information we need in order to calculate. And this is essentially how we pass on information with PHP, because we usually use the URL to do this sort of thing. So what we need to do now is actually go down and write PHP code that goes into the URL and fetches this information and does something with it based on what's up here. So if we go down to our code, underneath the form, we're going to go ahead and start writing stuff. So we need to open up the PHP tags. Like so. Now before the PHP tag, we might want to add maybe some text that says, here is the answer. So we can actually let people know that the answer is going to be here. So in between the form and the PHP tags, I'm just going to add a paragraph and say this, or maybe the answer is colon. And then we can actually start writing stuff inside the PHP tags. Now the first thing we need to do is actually check if we did actually hit the submit button. Because if we haven't hit the submit button yet and we're already checking for answers inside the URL, it's going to give us an error message. Because there's nothing inside the URL if you haven't actually clicked anything yet, as you guys can see up here. So we need to first check if the calculate button has actually been hit. So the way we're going to do that is by going into our PHP code. we're going to go ahead and say if. So we're just going to go ahead and write an if statement here. Then we're going to say inside the parentheses, if is set, which means that if this has been set already, meaning that if we did actually hit the button, parentheses again, and inside the parentheses, we're going to go ahead and check for submit. So we need to go up into the URL, and if there's in fact a submit that's equal to submit, then it needs to do this kind of code down here. So inside our parentheses, we're going to say variable underscore get, because we're actually checking for a get method. Now, we didn't actually talk about get and post method in PHP before. We did talk about it in the HTML and CSS series, but basically when we use a get method into the URL, like passing information into it, we can actually see the information up here in the URL like we can right now. If you use a post method, we can't actually see the information in the URL, but it's still there. So in this case, we can actually see the information, which means that it's a get method. So we need to ask for a get method. Then we're going to put brackets, single quotes, and in between here, we need to ask what kind of information from the URL we're actually getting. In this case, it's the one that's called submit as a name. So I'm going to go ahead and write submit. So now we're actually asking if this is actually been set. So we can actually go inside the if statement and start typing stuff. So the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to go back into the URL and get the rest of the answers that we've typed in before. So we can actually go ahead and create a variable. And let's just go ahead and call this one result 1. We're going to set it equal to whatever's inside the URL, which has, what did we call it, num1 as a result. So we're just going to go ahead and copy our get method up here, paste it down here, and of course change the answer from submit to num1. Then we're going to copy this line, paste it below a couple of times, change the second line from result 2 to result 2, and change it from num1 to num2. The last one down here we're going to call operator, and then we're going to go ahead and ask for operator, because we did actually set our select up here to operator as a name. So now that we've done this, we actually get the different answers from the URL itself. So the next thing we need to do is actually to tell it what to do with this information if we get a certain type. Now we can do this in two different ways. Either we can use an if statement or a switch statement in order to do something with the results. And since we did already use an if statement here, I think we should actually try and use a switch. So down here, we're going to create a switch, like so, create parentheses, curly brackets, and then we need to tell it what we're actually trying to get inside the switch here. So in this case, we want to get the operator, like so, and put it inside our parentheses, because we're actually checking for the operator. You know, if we did actually add, we need to do one certain thing with the addition. If we actually subtracted, we need to do something else with the actual calculation. So inside the switch, we're going to set up a case, and we're going to go ahead and say that if the case is equal to add, then it should do something. Well, actually, the first one we have is actually the one called none, so we should probably take that one first. So if the user did not select anything, it should do this. So I'm going to go ahead and say if they did not select anything, I'm going to echo out error, because they do actually need to select something. Well, we could actually just say you need to select a method, like so. So if you didn't choose anything, you need to actually select a method. And of course, we do need to set the none as a string. So the next one, or we do actually need to add the break as well. I forgot that, like so. So now we can just sort of copy this one, paste it below a couple of times. We need 4 more, I do believe. And then we're going to set the second one as add with a big A. We're going to set the third one as subtract. We're going to set the fourth one, I do believe it is, as multiply. Let's actually get rid of that Danish letter. Multiply. There we go. And the last one is going to be divide. So now we need to actually calculate inside instead of echoing. So in this case, we're actually just going to go ahead and say echo And then we would like to take result 1 and say plus result 2. Like so. This is basically all we need. Down here, we're actually going to go ahead and just copy the echo for the rest of them. Like so. Like so. And like so. So now we just need to change the plus symbol to a minus on the second one. The third one, we're going to change to a multiply. And the last one is going to be divide. So now, depending on what kind of operator we choose inside our form, it's going to choose one of these switches. And the reason we need to set, the numbers is so that when we do actually choose a switch or like a case down here, it needs to do something with the information that we typed in. So now we can actually go to our browser. If I just go ahead and go back so we don't have anything, you guys can see that if I do actually go into number 1 and click 5, number 2, click 10, and then go into my drop down and say I want to add them. I can actually calculate, and you can see we get 15. I can also go in and add 20 if I want to, and 34, and maybe multiply, and you guys will see we get 680. So this is how we can build a basic calculator using PHP code, and this is going to give you guys a really good idea about how we use PHP code inside a website. Again, calculators are not very exciting to build, but it's a really good exercise to show you guys how we use if statements and how we use switches and that sort of thing when we build functions inside a website. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. We will actually start talking about, I think we'll take a couple more examples for the next couple of episodes, just to show a couple of other ways we can use PHP code, at least with the stuff we've learned so far. We do actually need to learn a couple more things regarding, fundamentals of PHP, but in order to, just to give you guys some examples so you guys don't get too bored, I'm going to go ahead and spend a couple more episodes showing you guys some other stuff. So hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.
Okay, so another example.
Today we're going to do another exercise using PHP code. And I thought for this episode, we would try to build some text inside the browser, which tells us what day of the week it is, and if it's a workday or weekend. Now, I know that that might not seem very complicated, and it really isn't, but we will actually be talking about how to write HTML code inside PHP code, which is something that you're going to be using a lot in the future, meaning that this episode will actually be quite worth a lot to you if you don't know how to do this yet. So we're just going to go ahead and jump straight into it here. As you guys can see, I do actually have my index file here. I have a basic, startup HTML code, which simply says that we're going to write an HTML5 front page, and we're just going to go ahead and start writing stuff into the body here. Now, inside the body, we're going to go ahead and open up our PHP code with PHP tags. And in between here, we're going to go ahead and create a variable. Now, you guys can call whatever you want. I'm going to go ahead and call this one day of week. And I'm going to go ahead and set it equal to a function called date. Now, date is a function that's inside PHP already. We didn't actually create this, it's already existing. And there's a lot of different parameters we can put inside the date parentheses. And I do actually have a link for you guys to actually take a look at, which is inside w3schools.com. This website, by the way, is really awesome for looking up stuff, so I can really recommend you guys to go in here if you don't know how to do something and learn about it. So in here, we do actually have a description of all the different parameters we can put inside, this function, which will actually tell us specific information about the date we have today. So right now we can actually go in and see one called W, lowercase w, I should mention, because there's a difference if you use lowercase letters or uppercase letters. Now the lowercase w will actually tell us a numeric representation of the day, 0 being Sunday and then 6 being Saturday, meaning that 1 is going to be Monday, then it's going to count up till 6 and then say 0, which is Sunday. So if we use W inside our date function, and it does actually say at the very top of this page, I will include a link to this page if you guys want to look at it inside the description of the video, so don't worry about having to Googling for this. But we're just going to go ahead and say, okay, we want to use the W, parameter inside our function. So we're going to go into our code, and inside the date, we're going to include double quotes or single quotes, depending on what you want to use. And in here, we're going to say W. Now, if we go ahead and just echo this out, just to see what we actually get from this, I'm going to echo out day of week. Refresh my browser. You guys will notice we get 5. Now, right here where I'm sitting at this very moment as I'm creating this tutorial, it's actually Friday, which is 5 because Saturday is 6 and then Sunday is going to be 0 and then Monday is going to be 1 again. So because it says 5, we know that it's Saturday. No, sorry, Friday. I'm mixing up the dates now. But it's Friday today, which is equal to 5. So we can actually go back into our code and we can actually start writing a switch. Now, I'm going to go ahead and write a switch here. And you guys should know how to do that by now, so I'm not going to explain too much about it, other than we're just going to start it up here. Now, the data that we're looking for, that we're actually checking for, is going to be inside the parentheses, which is, the variable we created called day of week. Inside the switch, we're going to go ahead and start creating our cases. So case number 1 is going to be, okay, so if day of week is equal to 1, then do this. So I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, if it's equal to 1, we want to echo that it is Monday, because it is, if it's 1, but it's not today. So we do actually need to create another case. I'm just going to go ahead and include my break here really quickly. So we're just going to go ahead and copy this case underneath here. Whoops, let's actually go ahead and do that properly. There we go. Like so, like so, like so. Let's see, how many do we have so far? We do actually need 7 because there's 7 days in a week. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And now we just need to change the numbers. Remember, when we get to Sunday, we need to change it to a 0. So we're just going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 0. So we're just going to go ahead and change the text in here as well. So we're going to say Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and of course, Sunday. So now, if we actually go ahead and save this, we can actually go ahead and go back to our browser, refresh, and you guys will say it says it is Friday, which it may or may not be in your case, but at least for me, it is Friday. So now we have the text going on. But what if we want to include some styling to this, or include some, HTML tags to it? Now, in order to do that, well, first of all, let's actually go ahead and create some styling. I do actually have some styling in here inside my style sheet. And if you guys don't have a style sheet yet, I did actually include one into my document here. So you guys should just go ahead and create some styling inside a style sheet. And you guys can copy or just write your own styling depending on what you want to do. I simply styled a paragraph tag in here, where I just simply, aligned it to the center. Font size is a lot. I changed the font family to Arial, and I set a margin to the top, 38 VH, which is view height. Now, going back to our code inside our index file, we can actually go down to, for example, our Monday. Actually, let's actually take Friday, because that's the day we're on right now. And inside the double quotes, and do bear in mind, every time you want to write HTML code inside PHP code, you have to write it inside quotes. So I can actually start writing tags in here. For example, a P tag if I want to. I can also end my P tag, which should probably do after it is Friday. And we do actually already have styling for the paragraph in here. We could also add classes to this if you wanted to. But essentially, if you want to create HTML code inside PHP code, you just need to echo it out or print it or whatever you want to do and make sure it's inside parentheses. So you need to treat it like it's a string, which is very easy to remember. So we just have a paragraph here. If I actually go refresh the browser, you guys will see that we suddenly get a lot of text going on here. I can actually zoom out a bit where it says it is Friday. So we could actually do a bunch of stuff here. We could actually start adding maybe a video that covers the entire background that has, happy themed stuff because it's Friday, which means that it's weekend soon. or like really sad videos going on in the background if it's Monday, because we don't like Mondays. So this is essentially how we do this sort of thing. This is how we write HTML code. And yes, you can write whatever HTML code you write, you want to write inside, PHP tags like this if you echo it out. So that's basically how we do that. I don't think I had anything else for this episode. So that's basically what I want to teach you guys in this episode. I'm just going to go ahead and end it off here, and I'll see you guys next episode.
Okay, so since we already finished with conditional structure, we may proceed to the repetition control structure. So in this lesson, the student should have learned to discover looping structure of PHP and able to utilize the use of looping structure. The for loop, we have for loop, while loop, do while loop. For loop, it's simply a while loop with a bit more code added to it. So the common tasks that are covered by for loop are set a counter variable to some initial value, check to see if the conditional statement is true, execute the code within the loop, and increment a counter at the end of each iteration through the loop. The for loop allows you to define these steps in one easy line of code. It may seem to have an odd form, so pay close attention to the syntax used. Another, of course, is a while loop. So repetitive tasks are always a burden to us. Deleting spam email, stealing 50 envelopes, and going to work are all example of tasks that are repeated. The nice thing about programming is that you can avoid such repetitive tasks with a little bit of extra thinking. Now, most often, these repetitive tasks are conquered in the loop. The idea of a loop is to do something over and over again until the task has been completed. Before we show how a real example when you might need one, let's go over the structure of the PHP while loop. Of course, I will show you a video presentation about an example of a while loop statement.
Today we're going to talk about something called a loop inside PHP, and a loop is something we're going to use quite often when you code PHP code. So my thought was, for this episode, we're going to do an introduction to what loops are, and we're going to talk about the first loop, which is called a while loop, at least the first one I'm going to talk about. Now, there's different types of loops out there, and as you guys can see, I did actually list a couple of examples here. Well, I did actually list all the examples here. We have something called a while loop, do while loop, for loop, and a for each loop. So the one we're going to focus on today, like I said, is the one called a while loop. Now, the basic idea behind a loop is that, well, let's look at it this way. If we have an if statement, we're basically checking if a certain condition is true, and then we're doing something on the screen, like, for example, writing out hello in an echo. Now, a loop is going to keep spitting out information and repeatedly spit out information as long as a condition is true. So to give you guys an example, let's actually go ahead and write out a while loop down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and write while, parentheses, curly brackets, and then inside my parentheses, we need some kind of statement that we need to check if it's true. So for this example, let's actually go ahead and say we have a variable called x, which needs to be less than 5. Now, right now we don't actually have x set to anything, so I'm actually going to go ahead and create a variable up on top called x, which is equal to 1. So inside this while loop, we need to write something that needs to happen on the screen while this statement in here keeps being true. So for this example, let's actually go ahead and echo out some text. And I'm just going to go ahead and echo out hi there. Now I'm going to go ahead and include a break. So we go down to the next line because we will actually be looping out a couple of sentences here. So let's actually go ahead and include a HTML break. And we did actually talk about that in the last episode, I think 2 episodes ago. or was it last episode? I don't remember. But if we do actually include HTML text inside a string, then we can actually see the text as actual code if you're echoing it out inside PHP. So if I save this, now what I have here is something called an infinite loop. And it's not something that you want to have, because right now x is equal to 1. And if I were to say, okay, while x is equal to 1, or like while x is lesser than 5, which is going to be the whole time, it should spit out hi there. If I were to run this in the browser right now, it's going to keep spitting out infinitely hi there. And that's what we call an infinite loop. So we don't want that inside the browser, since it can essentially crash your computer. So what I recommend you guys to do is to always check for these end loops. You always want to make sure that this condition in here will end at some point. So underneath our echo, we're going to go ahead and write something we talked about pretty early on in these PHP episodes, which is basically that we're going to say that we're going to take our variable called x plus plus, meaning that once we go down to the bottom of this, whatever's going on in here, then it needs to add 1 to x, meaning that while it loops through this the first time, x is equal to 1, but when it gets to the end here, it's going to be equal to 2, meaning that when we start over, x is equal to 2. And it's going to keep doing that until it becomes 4, where when it hits 5, it's going to be equal to 5, meaning that it's going to stop, because now x is actually greater than lesser than 5. So let's actually go ahead and loop this out on the screen and just see what happens. And as you guys can see, we get hi there, hi there, hi there, and hi there 4 times. Now if I were to set this lesser than or equal to 5, of course we would have one more, because now we do actually say that it can also be 5. But this is the basic idea behind a while loop. Now again, like I said, there's different kinds of loops, and you might want to use them depending on different purposes. Now with databases, I usually like to use while loops in a lot of cases. Now I do also use the other loops as well, but in a lot of cases I mostly use the while loop, which is why I think you guys should get really familiar with the while loop specifically, because we will be using it once we do actually learn how to set up, for example, a login system, that sort of thing, from the database. So this is the basic idea behind a loop, and it's really not that complicated. The most complicated thing about loops is memorizing what each of these loops actually does and when you need to use them in certain situations. So this is the basic idea behind the while loop. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.
So this time, do while loops in PHP.
Today we're going to continue talking about loops inside PHP, and as you guys can see, we're going to talk about something called a do while loop in this episode. Now, I still have my code here from the last episode, where we basically had a variable called x, which is equal to 1, and then we have a while loop down here that says while this statement in here is true, then it's going to do whatever's down here. So in this episode, like I said, we're going to talk about a do while loop, which is a little bit different than a while loop. So in order to explain it, let's actually go ahead and write one out. I'm going to go ahead and go on top of my while loop, and I'm going to write do, curly brackets, and I'm going to take all the code we have down here inside the while brackets down here. I'm going to copy it and delete it, and paste it inside my do statement. Now I'm going to take the curly brackets from my while loop, delete them, and instead I'm going to write semicolon after the parentheses end. So this is how a do while loop looks like. And you might be asking, what is the difference between a do while loop and a while loop? Well, in a while loop, it's not going to write anything on the screen unless the condition in here is true. A do while loop is always going to write whatever's in here once. Even if that statement down here is not true, it's always going to write this once, and then afterwards, that one time, it's going to start looking at the while loop. Meaning that right now, if I were to actually go ahead and say, x is equal to 10 instead of 1, it's actually not true to the while loop. Meaning that if I just had a while loop, it would actually not write anything on the screen because, the statement is not true in here. But if I do actually save this, go into my browser, you guys can see it says hi there. And that's because it will always write out this statement once and then check if this statement is true. Now, if I do actually go ahead and write that x is equal to 1 instead, it's going to go ahead and write this out 5 times. So let's actually go ahead and go in here, refresh, and you guys will see it says hi there, hi there, hi there 5 times. And that's because our while statement is true until it hits 5. So that's the basic difference between do while loops and a while loop. There's not a lot of difference. Like I said, the only difference is really that we just always echo out this statement here once before we start checking for the statement inside the while loop. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you guys next time.
Okay, so a while ago, already discussed what is for loops, PHP. Actually, in other programming languages, they prefer to use for loops, no. But of course, as ako personally, no, I also prefer to use while loop, no, in PHP programming. No, but like let's say for example for C language, no, for C++, Java, most commonly for loops, but it depends upon of course to the problem no that I wanted to solve. Now again, that's why we have different for loops or we have different loop control structure loops no because maybe there is certain application for every loops, okay?
Today we're going to talk about something called a for loop inside PHP, and a for loop is a little bit different than a while loop, which we did actually talk about in the past 2 episodes, because in a while loop we don't know how many times we're going to loop something out, but in a for loop we know exactly how many times we're going to loop something beforehand. So to give you guys an example of a for loop, let's actually go ahead and write one out. I'm going to say for, parentheses, curly brackets. Now in a while loop, inside the parentheses, we're just going to put in a condition that needs to be true in order for it to keep looping something out. Now in a for loop, we're going to put 3 different parameters inside the parentheses, which are going to tell us how many times we need to loop something. So the first parameter we're going to put inside the parentheses is something called an initializing counter, which basically tells the loop where it needs to start. So inside the parentheses, we're going to put in the first parameter, which is going to be a variable. I'm going to go ahead and call this one x. You guys can call whatever you want. And we need to set it equal to something. Now I'm just going to put it equal to 0 because that's just a typical habit to do when you do examples. And I'm going to go ahead and separate this one from the last parameters by a semicolon. So basically what we're saying is that, okay, we need to loop something and we need to start at 0. Now the next one is going to tell us when to stop looping. So inside the second parameter, we're going to go ahead and set variable x lesser than or equal to 10. So now we're saying, okay, we start at 0, and once you reach lesser than or equal to 10, then you need to stop looping, because like we talked about in the past couple of episodes, if you have an infinite loop, you might end up crashing your browser. So we want to make sure that the loop actually stops at some point. So the last parameter we're going to put in here is basically what tells us, or like tells the loop, how many times you need to increase each time it loops something out. Now I'm going to go ahead and set this one as variable x plus plus, which means that we just add one more each time we're done looping. We could also say plus 3 if you want to, but we're just going to go ahead and use plus plus because that means incrementing by 1. Now I'm going to go ahead and put an echo inside my actual loop in here. I'm going to put it as a string. I'm going to set it to hi. Then I'm going to add a break just so we can see it go to the next line. And I'm going to end it off with a semicolon, of course. So after we put this in here, we can actually go to our browser, refresh, and you guys will see we get high until we reach 10, I think. Let's see if we actually do have 10. We have 5. We do actually have 11 because we did actually start at 0, meaning that it's going to reach, it's going to count 0 and then till 10, which is 11. So we did actually loop something out 11 times. We could change this to 9 if we want to loop out 10 times, or we can just set x equal to 1 if we want to loop out 9 times. So as you guys can see, we get 10 loops, not 9 like I said. So this is the basic idea behind a for loop, which allows for us to actually tell it beforehand how many times we want to loop something. Now, of course, x can always be changed by the user at some point, but the basic idea here is that we can, provide these different statements in here where we decide how many times it needs to increase or what the limit is for this x. So if the user types in x is equal to 2, then 2 is of course going to be, counting out less loops than 1. So this is basically what I wanted to talk about in this episode. For the next episode, we're going to talk about something called the for each loop. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.
Okay, so this will be an example of a for each loop in PHP.
In this episode, we're going to talk about something called the for each loop, which is the last loop we're going to talk about of all the loops we've been talking about for the last 3 episodes. So when we talk about a for each loop, it's a little bit different than the rest of the loops we talked about because a for each loop deals with something we call an array. Now, an array we haven't really discussed yet, but just to give you guys a very brief explanation of arrays, as you guys can see, I do actually have one written out here. And basically, an array is when we have a bunch of data which has been combined into one something, like a variable like we have here. So right now I do actually have a variable, which I called array, which is equal to an actual array, which has different data inside of it. So usually we would just have array equal to one string or something, or like a number. In this case, we do actually have multiple numbers inside one variable. So now that we have the array in here, we can actually start talking about the for each loop. Now, I'm just going to give you guys an example here underneath where I'm going to create a for each loop by writing for each space, parentheses, curly brackets. Now, a for each loop basically says inside the parentheses that we need to refer to an array, which we're going to loop through as we actually, loop through this thing in here, this function called a for each. And what we're basically going to do is every time we mention another variable which we create inside our loop, it's going to spit out a piece of data from this array which we created up here that we're going to refer to. So inside the parentheses, I'm going to go ahead and write the name of my array, or the array we're going to use in this example called array. I'm going to say as, and then I'm going to give it a name of another variable which we're going to use inside the loop. And we haven't created this one yet, but we're going to do it once we get inside the loop itself. So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable called, we can just call it loop data. And inside the loop itself, we can now start writing something. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to go ahead and, since we have names up here, inside the loop, I'm going to say echo string. And inside here, I'm going to say my name is space. Afterwards, I'm going to go ahead and say dot variable. And then I'm going to refer to the variable we created up here called loop data. Because each time we use loop data, it's going to go through this array and loop out the information. So if I do actually go ahead and write this like so, and go down to the next line. Actually, we don't need to go down to the next line. We can just go ahead and add a break after here, because we do want to have a break in between what we're writing here. So we have everything listed underneath each other. So if I do actually save this, refresh the browser, you guys will notice we get my name is Daniel, my name is Jane, my name is Jacob. And the really cool thing about for each loops is that we don't have to, increase some kind of number each time in order not to create the infinite loops that you might be able to create in the other examples. So in here, it's automatically going to stop looping as soon as the array doesn't have any more, variables or like data inside of it. So we can actually go ahead and, just include another couple ones in here. Just going to paste them some more. We can say John and Marianne. Marianne. We can say Marianne. And as you guys can see, it just continues looping out the rest of the names. So this is how a for each loop actually works. And there's not really a lot more to it. Now, we talked about a lot of different kinds of loops now, and you guys might not be able to see the purpose of each one of them, like in a real life example, but at some point we will be using these loops individually for some kind of experiment or, a little workshop we're going to do at some point. So for now, we talked about the loops, and we can actually start getting started on talking about a couple of other things that we need to know before we talk about databases. But soon we can actually start getting into databases, because in order to create something like a login system or a sign up system on a website, we do actually need to know just a little bit about databases. So soon we can actually start creating some really cool stuff inside a website. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you guys next time.
Okay, so as what I mentioned earlier, control structure are the core of programming logic. So they allow a script to react differently depending on what has already occurred or based on user input, and allow the graceful handling of repetitive tasks. In PHP, as what we discussed, there are two primary types of control structure: conditional statement and control loops. In the last discussion, you saw some brief example of control structure, and we will be taking closer actually with a different example. So in a conditional statements allow you to branch the path of execution in a script based on whether a single or multiple conditions evaluate to true or false. Put simply, they let you test things and perform various actions based on the results. The else if statement, thus far we have been able to respond to one condition and do something if that condition is not true. But what about evaluating multiple conditions? You could use a series of if statement to test each potential conditions. But in some situation that is not suitable option, we have of course else if statement come in, no? A combination of if and else statement. So else if statement were evaluated sequentially. So if the condition within the if statement is false, when a condition within an else if statement evaluates to true, the nested statements are parsed. No, the script stops executing the entire if else structure, and the rest of the script proceeds to be parsed. No, and of course the switch, no, or switch statement. Switches are a good alternative to if else statement, no, or else if statement in situation where you want to check multiple values against a single variable or conditions, no? Switch execute a little different than if else statement. Now, once a case value matches the value of the switch expressions, every following statement is executed, including those following other cases. And to prevent this from happening, a break statement is used. Yung break ends the execution of the switch statement and lets the script continue execution. It can also be used in a while or for loop statement. Actually, we have ternary operator also in PHP, no? Though technically an operator, not a control structure. So ternary operator represented by yung question mark, no, can be used as shorthand for simple if else statement. It can only be used in situations where you want to execute a single expressions based on whether a single condition is true or false. For the control loops, frequently in PHP actually, there are instances when you need to perform repetitive tasks, such as formatting data pulled from a database, sending out emails to a mailing list, or cycling through the contents of an array. So control loops allow you to perform this task almost effortlessly. Now we have while loops, we have do while, no, for loops, and for each statement. So I think that's it. But of course, what will be the things to remember? Number one, control structure are all the core of programming flow, allowing you to branch the execution of scripts based on input and easy handle repetitive tasks. There are two types of control structure, no, in PHP: conditional statement and control loops. Conditional statement and loops having only one nested statement do not require bracket. However, programmers frequently use them to make code more understandable. Nested statements are often indented for the same reason. And for the break, it can be used to end the execution of the current case. It can also be used to break out for loops and while loops, exit terminate the execution entire script, and may be used by anywhere within the script. Okay? So this will be our references, no? Okay, and I think next meeting we're going to discuss array, no? So since a while ago we have an activity or a demonstrations about array, so we're going to discuss it clearly and intensively next meeting. So I think that's it, and good day everyone. Enjoy coding. So this time we may proceed to a quiz, no, or a hands-on activity.